Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Don Keelan, joined here today with my co-host, Andrew McKeever, on how to have a more civil discourse. We are so privileged today to have as our guest Curtis Reed Jr. from southeastern Vermont. Welcome, Curtis.
Glad to be here.
Let me give our audience a brief background on our guest. Curtis serves as president of the CRJ Consulting Group and executive director of Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Diversity, and provides expert training and coaching and inclusion on inclusion, bias, and equity to state agencies, municipal, institutional, and business clients, as well as community organizations across Vermont. He serves as chair of the Vermont Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights and sits on statewide commissions dealing with law enforcement, education, and minority health issues. Curtis is a driving force behind 4 statewide initiatives. I should mention the Vermont African American Heritage Trail, the Vermont Vision for a Multicultural Future Initiative, I Am a Vermonter, and the think tank for Vermont leaders of color. After serving 18 years working with and living overseas in Arabic, Portuguese, and French-speaking countries, Curtis returned to Vermont in 2001 and continued to lead a practice that he's been doing almost for 4 decades in both international and domestic markets. And he is the recipient, I must say, of a Doctor of Letters from the International Training Graduate Institute for his life's work to make Vermont a more desirable destination for all. Wow, that is quite a background, Curtis, and thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome.
Allow me when I was reading this, I noticed that you came back to Vermont in 2001, having served 18 years abroad. Were you always from Vermont?
No, I'm a native of St. Louis, but I fell in love with Vermont before I knew Vermont even existed. I came here in 1978 during a nor'easter. It was February. Train dropped me off in Brattleboro, 2 a.m. A couple of us trudged up the hill to Dunkin' Donuts. I sat for 36 hours for my buddy to get plowed out of New Fame. And I spent 3 weeks eating, drinking, skiing, and picture postcard perfect Vermont. A couple of months later, I relocated here. And, it was a monumental move, but it's a great move. I'm bullish on Vermont. I love Vermont. And in spite of all of our warts, so to speak.
Let me ask another question regarding your working here now for the last 20 years now, over 20 years. Has Vermont become a better place for listening, more tolerance since your return in 2001, in your opinion?
In my opinion, it has become far more divisive. I think there's been a degradation in civil discourse. I think people are not willing to give other people's experience legitimacy. If your experience is not my experience, then your experience doesn't count.
And you're finding that in any particular part of Vermont, or would you say, in your opinion, it's throughout Vermont, really?
It's throughout the state. Yeah, there are. And we hear and see flashpoints that pop up all over the state. Most recently, we're running this campaign called Bigotry is Bad for Business. And I gave a talk before a school board, a supervisory union school board. And the chair of the high school board didn't like what I was saying and got up, left, and then returned when I left the room. And it was centered on the issue of the whitewashing of American history. And she appropriately asked for an example. Well, what do you mean by, sort of whitewashing? And I said to her, I said, well, let's think about how we teach who has the right to do exploring, to be explorers. And our history books tell us that it's white European men of a certain age, that they are the ones that have the right to explore. When we know that there were Indians that were exploring East Africa, West Africans that were exploring South America, that there were folks in Polynesia that were, exploring down in Australia, and that exploration is a human experience. But we teach our kids with these sort of blinders on that, or whitewashing, that only white men from Europe are explorers. She said she didn't want to hear it, gathered up her papers, left the room, and when I finished answering questions from other board members, she returned and took her seat.
And this goes right to the heart of what Andrew and I are trying to accomplish with this program, is to get there to be a better civil discourse, to get people to listen, and to get people to be on the other side of take the other side of the issue, and of course dealing with respect. How did the meeting gravitate? I don't want to dwell on the meeting so much, but because I want to hear your other experiences. But how did that meeting gravitate to such a state when, in fact, the purpose of the meeting, your mission, bigotry is bad for business, which is I couldn't agree more with you.
Right. Our demographics are changing. Our consumer bases, the demographics are changing outside of the state. If we are to survive economically, we need to attract, provide goods and services beyond the expectations of this new market. And we can't do that if our workforce that are currently in our schools, if our schools are producing knuckleheads. And what really drew my attention to doing this is that, you have a lot of social justice advocates, progressives and others that are making the argument that this is teaching these histories and having a more expansive education is the right thing to do. It's the good thing to do. And my argument is it's the economic imperative that says that we need to be teaching a much broader scope in our schools, so that white kids, when they enter the workforce, they're not condoning inappropriate language. We just had a series of racist and sexist speech on athletic fields in 4, 5, 6 communities around the state. And my concern is that's our future workforce. The kids who are spewing hate, in 5 or 10 years, that's going to be our workforce. But even more critically important is the fact that there were students and adults in the stands who heard this hate speech and said nothing. And I'm thinking about a corporation or a business. Do you want to have an environment in your business where hate speech is the norm? And that kind of speech is bad for business.
Well, Curtis, I wonder if I could jump in here just for a quick second and ask you, what do you think are the origins of this increased divisiveness that you were mentioning there a moment ago comparing now to, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, are there certain things that come to mind when you try and go back to, like, okay, how do we get here?
Sure. I think it's because it's the democratization of media, and everyone can live in their own echo chamber, and that's what's happening. And you know, 30, 40, 50 years ago, we didn't have that. We were our social construct was to engage in dialogue. To give the other person that you're engaged with the benefit of the doubt. You might not agree with them, but you at least were respectful of their opinion, of their life experience. I think that's happening less and less and less these days, where people are only repeating things out of their own silo, out of their own chamber.
Now, to follow up on that, may I do that, Andrew?
Oh, yeah. This is our first time doing this over Zoom, Curtis, so we're used to being in the studio and reading each other's body language, I guess.
Yes, I know what that's like.
I want to follow up on the term you use, or the phrase echo chambers. Last week, Andrew and I had on as guests two professors from Bennington College. I believe they know you, but they were dealing with this subject, and they were sharing with us the fact that what they're seeing is that we've become somewhat tribal, in that we only have one news source that we rely on. We constant work with social media, and less and less face to face. This is not just one side. The professors were saying this is on both sides.
Right.
So, how do you address that? I mean, how do you help us going forward? Because that's the purpose of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to have an engagement.
Well, that's sort of the cornerstone of our work, is listening and helping people listen to each other. But it starts with creating an inclusive community, or a learning community, where you walk into a relationship, you walk into a conversation with the idea that you want to actively learn something from the other individual, and that you seek to understand before being understood. We often find people that want to jump straight to their argument, or to defend what it is that they want to defend, without ever having listened to what the other person has said. So it's slowing things down. You need to be in a space where you're not rushed. You need to accept that the conversation and the arguments that are put forth may not find resolution. But if your purpose is to find out, what is it about this, whatever subject might be, that excites the imagination of the other.
Let me go back, if I may. You mentioned the teaching, and of course, so much comes from that, and teaching history. I may have shared with you before the fact that today, or back when I took American history and world history, it was a 45-minute class. I'm going to be showing you my age now. That's okay. Today it's still 45 minutes, and in the space of those 65 years, we've added went from 87 to 198 countries to the UN, and we've added 13 presidents here in America. So if we are going to be more inclusive in our education programs, particularly our history and so forth, What gives? How would, or if you were addressing history teachers, excuse me, what would you advise them to do?
Well, there's set of core skills that we're trying to teach kids, and research is one of those. We want our students to understand that there are multiple sources and multiple perspectives. So for that history assignment, if I was a history teacher, I would say I would assign a couple of kids to research Asian explorers. I would assign another couple of kids on African explorers or Indian explorers, where they're utilizing their noggins to do the research, whether they do it online or in books, and then come back to present out what they've learned in terms of content. But it's really the process, the teaching kids how to think, not what to think.
Mm-hmm.
And,
excuse me, Curtis. I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to ask you, and I hope this is sort of related to what you're talking about here. What do you make of the whole discussion and debate around critical race theory that exploded in the Virginia governor's race that was concluded last month? That seemed to be a huge issue, and I think a lot of people didn't really understand what that was all about. But it seemed to become kind of a pretext for. It sounds like some of the same themes you're alluding to right here around how parents should control what's being taught in their schools. I guess I just wondered what your reaction was to that, and I think the real, the widespread misunderstanding about what critical race theory is all about.
Yes, there's the anti-CRT operatives could not tell you what critical race theory is. They think that it's taught in pre-K through 12. They think that it is they conflate it with racism. They conflate it with structural racism. They conflate it with social justice and anything else that they don't like. It's like throwing the kitchen sink into this. And the messaging on the right is really quite skillful. But what CRT is, I mean, it's been around for over 40 years. It is used to analyze systems, not individual behavior, but like whole systems, education, finance, healthcare, transportation, taking those systems and doing an analysis of those systems through the critical lens of race. Just a really quick example, either you or your fathers benefited from the GI Bill. After World War II, after the Korean War, white veterans, could get a low mortgage FHA loan, or they could get funds to go to college or tech center. The federal government said that Black vets, although they put their lives on the line for this country, were denied any of the benefits under the GI Bill. That's a structural piece in that, the federal government sort of accelerated the growth of a middle class, a white middle class that, bought property, they had equity in their homes. They leveraged that equity to pay for their kids' college education. And at the same time, banks were redlining areas where African Americans were living, so that there was no access to capital to even do sort of home improvements, where home ownership was at a much lower rate than it was among sort of white vets. So that's a structural sort of analysis and how that affects healthcare, school funding. You know, if you have lower property taxes, then you don't have enough revenue to provide the kind of education that you would like for your community. Whereas in more affluent communities, you know, they have all the books and the labs and all the extracurricular activities. And that's by virtue of a decision by the federal government 65 years ago when the GI Bill came out. So, but I want to get back to this listening part and making the assumption that what someone else has to say has value. A lot of communication that is going on, a lot of what we're observing is that one party does not value the humanity of the other, does not value what it is, their experience, doesn't value the way that they look at the world. And so you retreat into your stereotypes and nothing moves, or it moves very slowly.
May I follow up on that? About listening, I believe it was last week or the week before, you were part of a 2-day conference with the Vermont Chamber of Commerce executive directors, if I'm not mistaken, up in, I'm going to say Montpelier, but I may be wrong about that. And there were 19 executive directors there. I gather it was a 2-day conference.
Right.
Dealing with a lot of these topics that we're talking about. How did they, from your vantage point, seem to be? Were they listening to you? And was
yes. Yeah, and the reason they listened to me is not because of any social or moral arguments, but because what I was speaking to was, you know, how do your local chamber members make more money?
Mm-hmm.
And if they want to have access to a marketplace that is increasingly Black and brown, then they're going to need to rethink what customer service means. They're going to have to rethink, you know, how do we promote our services? You know, I'll give you an example from state government. So, you know, so the state government gave, I think last year, $10,000 for telecommuters to move to Vermont. And then there was $7,500 for folks to move to Vermont. Where they promoted those two programs were in largely mainstream media. To the extent that, you know, the media that you know, Black families and entrepreneurs and outdoor enthusiasts of color frequent did not receive the message that, you know, Vermont is open for business. Vermont is open for, you know, trying to entice you to move to the state. But in terms of the chamber, you know, as we look at, that's just one example of how opportunities are missed because we have a very narrow understanding of the experience of others.
Was the program that you presented up there, was that similar to what you had presented down in, was it Bellows Falls or Brattleboro?
Yes,
where you,
yes.
Bigotry is bad for business?
Exactly, same thing.
And among the members up there, nobody got up and walked out on you?
No,
oh,
no.
Okay. So,
No, and again, because we're appealing to their economic interests, their economic self-interest. They need a workforce that can thrive in a multiracial democracy and a multicultural marketplace. There are those in our communities that don't believe that we're in a multiracial democracy. They don't want to have a multiracial democracy. They only want to have a democracy for white people. They don't believe that Black and brown consumers across the nation, that there's enough of them to be able to share in the bounty that Vermont offers outdoor enthusiasts, whether it's skiing or snowboarding, cycling, running marathon, whatever the outdoor activity might be. If you believe that those activities are only relegated to whites, then you're losing out on a huge and fast growing marketplace. So in order to have access to that marketplace, then you need to begin to think about, how do I change my marketing? How do I change my promotion? How do I change what my front retail staff, in terms of how they respond to folks who don't look or sound like them?
I know we're running out of time. Is that right, Andrew? And
We are out of time.
Chris, thank you so much for being with us today, and Andrew, and look forward to maybe having Curtis back on again. We have so much to cover.
Well,
Sure. Well, do you have my numbers?
All right,
all right. We'll be getting in touch.
Okay.
Curtis, good luck.
Okay.
Good luck in all that you're doing for Vermont.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.